Picture this. It's 331 BC, and 47,000 men are about to face an army of over 200,000 Persian soldiers. The odds? Absolutely impossible. The location? The dusty plains of Gaugamela, in what's now modern-day Iraq. And the result? Total annihilation. But not for who you'd think. You see, those 47,000 men didn't just win. They completely obliterated an army 4 times their size, losing only 500 soldiers in the process. And boy, did they enjoy crushing every single enemy that stood in their way. This wasn't luck. This wasn't a fluke. This was the Macedonian army, the most devastating military force the ancient world had ever seen. In just 13 years, whilst their leader was still in his 20s and early 30s, they conquered over 2 million square miles of territory. That's larger than the Roman Empire at its peak. They marched 22,000 miles on foot. That's almost the entire circumference of Earth. They fought in deserts, crossed the Hindu Kush mountains in winter, and battled war elephants in India. And here's the absolutely insane part. They never lost a single major battle. Not one. 0 defeats. It's a military record that has never been matched in human history. But how does a small kingdom from northern Greece, considered barbarians by their neighbors, end up conquering the known world? How does an army of farmers and shepherds become an unstoppable force that makes elite Persian immortals flee in terror? The truth behind this story is even crazier than the statistics suggest. Because this wasn't just about military tactics or superior weapons. This was about one young man's obsession with becoming a god, and the army of devoted soldiers who believed he actually was one. Welcome to the insane true story of Alexander the Great and his invincible Macedonian army. Alexander was born in 356 BC in Pella, the capital of Macedonia. But this wasn't your typical royal birth. On the very night Alexander entered the world, the Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, burned to the ground. Ancient historians would later claim the goddess was too busy attending Alexander's birth to save her temple. It was an early sign that this child was destined for something extraordinary. You see, Alexander's mother Olympias was, let's say, intense. She claimed that Alexander wasn't actually the son of King Philip II, but rather the offspring of Zeus himself. She kept snakes in her bedroom for religious rituals and filled young Alexander's head with stories of divine destiny. Alexander would later reflect on this and say his mother's ambitions for him were harder to bear than any enemy army. It was an early lesson for Alexander that sometimes your greatest challenges come from those closest to you. But if his mother gave him divine ambitions, his father gave him the tools to achieve them. Philip II wasn't just any king. He was a military genius who had transformed Macedonia from a backwater kingdom into the dominant power in Greece. And he made sure his son learned from the best. At age 13, Philip hired the greatest philosopher of the age to tutor his son, Aristotle. For 3 years, Alexander studied everything from philosophy to medicine, from poetry to politics. Aristotle taught him that Greeks were naturally superior to barbarians, meaning anyone who wasn't Greek. He must have thought it was his destiny to rule over these lesser peoples. The truth is, this education created a fascinating contradiction in Alexander's character. He could quote Homer's Iliad from memory and debate philosophy with scholars, yet he could also drink any soldier under the table and fight on the front lines like a common warrior. At 16, Alexander got his first taste of real power. Philip left to attack Byzantium, leaving his teenage son as regent of Macedonia. Most princes would have simply maintained the status quo. Not Alexander. When the Maedi tribe revolted, Alexander didn't just suppress them. He completely destroyed their capital and renamed it Alexandropolis. It was the first of many cities he would name after himself. You see, Alexander realized something crucial. Fear and admiration were 2 sides of the same coin. If you were brutal enough to your enemies, but generous enough to your followers, you could build something extraordinary. The relationship between Alexander and Philip was complicated. Philip was proud of his son's abilities, but also threatened by them. Things came to a head at Philip's wedding to his 7th wife, Cleopatra. When Cleopatra's uncle drunkenly suggested that now Philip could have a legitimate heir, implying Alexander was a bastard, Alexander threw his cup at the man's head. Philip, also drunk, drew his sword on his own son. But the king was so intoxicated, he tripped and fell. Alexander stood over his fallen father and sneered, "Look, men who are preparing to cross from Europe to Asia. He can't even cross from one couch to another." It was a moment that revealed everything about Alexander's character, his quick temper, his devastating wit, and his complete lack of fear, even of his own father. In 336 BC, everything changed. Philip was assassinated at his daughter's wedding by one of his own bodyguards. The killer was immediately speared by Philip's guards, conveniently preventing any interrogation. Many suspected Olympias was behind it, possibly with Alexander's knowledge. But here's the crucial part. Whether Alexander was involved or not, he was ready. Within hours of Philip's death, Alexander had secured the loyalty of the army and eliminated all potential rivals to the throne. His speed was breathtaking. Using these new connections with key generals who had served his father, Alexander immediately marched south. The Greek city-states, thinking this 20-year-old boy would be easy to control, were about to learn a harsh lesson. When Thebes revolted, believing false rumors that Alexander had died in battle, Alexander appeared at their gates with his army before they even finished fortifying their defenses. But Alexander saw an opportunity here. Instead of just defeating Thebes, he completely destroyed it. 6,000 Thebans were killed, 30,000 sold into slavery, and the entire city was razed to the ground, except for the temples and the house of the poet Pindar, whom Alexander admired. The message was clear: oppose me and face total annihilation. But show respect and be rewarded. In many ways, it was such an incredibly simple move, but it was the meticulous planning and shocking brutality that made it effective. The other Greek cities immediately fell in line. But conquering Greece was never Alexander's real goal. His eyes were fixed on the Persian Empire, the superpower that had invaded Greece multiple times and was considered invincible. The Persian Empire stretched from modern-day Turkey to India, controlling the wealth of the known world. Most Greeks thought attacking Persia was suicide. What they didn't realize was that Alexander had inherited something far more valuable than just an army from his father. Philip had revolutionized warfare with the Macedonian phalanx, soldiers armed with 18-foot spears called sarissas, arranged in tight formations that were nearly impenetrable. He had created the companion cavalry, elite horsemen who could smash through enemy lines. Most importantly, he had created a professional army, soldiers who fought year-round, not just during campaign season. Alexander took this military machine and added his own innovations. He created specialized units, shield bearers who could rapidly deploy to weak points, engineers who could build siege equipment on the spot, and light cavalry for scouting and harassment. But his real genius was psychological. Alexander fought alongside his men, not behind them. He knew every officer by name, shared their hardships, and rewarded loyalty extravagantly. When a soldier saved his life in battle, Alexander gave him command of a province. The truth is, Alexander understood something that most leaders miss. Soldiers don't fight for causes or countries. They fight for leaders they believe in. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia with just 35,000 men. To put this in perspective, the Persian Empire could field armies of over 500,000. It was like Luxembourg declaring war on China. But Alexander had studied every Persian defeat, every weakness in their system. What most people didn't realize was that the Persian Empire, despite its size, was actually quite fragile. It was a patchwork of conquered peoples held together by fear and gold. Alexander's plan was brilliantly simple. Win spectacular victories to shatter the myth of Persian invincibility, then offer the conquered peoples a better deal than the Persians ever had. The first test came at the Granicus River. The Persians had taken a strong defensive position on the opposite bank. Alexander's generals advised waiting until morning to find a better crossing point. Alexander's response? He personally led the companion cavalry straight across the river and up the muddy banks into the teeth of the Persian army. It was borderline suicidal, but it worked. The Persians, shocked by the sheer audacity, broke and fled. Alexander had nearly died when a Persian noble's axe split his helmet, but the victory established his reputation. This was a commander who would risk everything for victory. But here's the crucial part. After the battle, Alexander did something unexpected. Instead of looting and enslaving the conquered cities, he declared them free and reduced their taxes below what the Persians had charged. He kept local customs, appointed local governors, and only required recognition of his authority. Cities started opening their gates without a fight. What the Persians didn't realize was that Alexander wasn't just conquering territory. He was building an empire of willing subjects. The showdown everyone had been waiting for came at Issus in 333 BC. Darius III, the Persian king of kings, had personally taken the field with an army of over 100,000. The battlefield was narrow, neutralizing the Persian numerical advantage. But the real masterstroke was psychological. Alexander had learned that Darius had brought his mother, wife, and daughters to watch his inevitable victory. During the battle, Alexander led a cavalry charge straight at Darius himself. The Persian king, seeing this wild-eyed young man cutting through his bodyguards like wheat, did something that doomed his empire. He fled. The sight of the King of Kings running from a 23-year-old boy caused a complete collapse. The Persian army disintegrated. After the battle, Alexander captured Darius's family. Everyone expected the usual: rape, slavery, humiliation. Instead, Alexander treated them with perfect courtesy, addressing Darius's mother as mother, and ensuring the women were protected and honored. When Darius offered half his empire for their return, Alexander refused. His general Parmenion said, "I would accept if I were Alexander." Alexander replied, "So would I, if I were Parmenion." Alexander now had 120,000 talents from the Persian treasury. That's roughly $50 billion in today's money, and this is very different to what normal kings would do with such wealth. Instead of hoarding it, Alexander spent it lavishly on his soldiers, on building projects, on spreading Greek culture. He understood that wealth was only useful if it was working for you. The siege of Tyre showed another side of Alexander's character. This island fortress had never fallen in its history. It was considered impregnable. Alexander's solution? Build a half-mile causeway from the mainland to the island. It took 7 months, thousands of lives, and engineering that seemed impossible. When the city finally fell, Alexander crucified 2,000 defenders and sold 30,000 into slavery. The message was clear: resist me and face horrors beyond imagination. Submit and be treated as friends. After Tyre, most cities chose submission. By 330 BC, Alexander had conquered the Persian Empire and captured Darius, who was murdered by his own nobles before Alexander could reach him. At 26, he ruled the largest empire the world had ever seen. But the problem was, Alexander had achieved his life's goal before he turned 30. What do you do when you've conquered the known world? For Alexander, the answer was simple: conquer the unknown world. But the invincible Macedonian army didn't stop there. Alexander pushed into Afghanistan, then India, fighting in conditions his men had never experienced. They battled mountain tribes in freezing passes, crossed deserts where the sand was too hot to walk on, and faced war elephants that terrified even veteran soldiers. Little did Alexander know that his greatest enemy wasn't foreign armies. It was his own success. You see, as Alexander conquered more territory, he began adopting local customs. He wore Persian dress, required the Asian practice of prostration before him, and married multiple foreign princesses. To Alexander, this was pragmatic empire building. To his Macedonian soldiers, it was betrayal. The boy they had followed from Macedonia was becoming an oriental despot. The cracks started showing in Afghanistan. The guerrilla warfare was unlike anything they had faced. Cities that surrendered would revolt as soon as Alexander left. His solution became increasingly brutal. Entire populations massacred, cities burned, salt sown in the fields. Alexander was becoming the very type of tyrant he had once claimed to oppose. The breaking point came in India. At the Hyphasis River, after defeating King Porus and his war elephants in perhaps his most difficult battle, Alexander ordered his army to march further east. He spoke of conquering the Ganges Valley, of reaching the edge of the world. But for the first time in 8 years, his army said no. These men had marched 22,000 miles, fought in every climate, and made fortunes beyond their dreams. They wanted to go home. Alexander sulked in his tent for 3 days, but eventually relented. However, back in Babylon, people were starting to ask questions about this self-proclaimed god king, who seemed more interested in conquest than governance. Then in June 323 BC, something happened that would end the greatest military career in history. After a drinking party in Babylon, Alexander fell ill with a fever. For a man who had survived countless battles, dozens of wounds, and assassination attempts, it seemed impossible that mere sickness could kill him. But over the next 2 weeks, Alexander's condition worsened. He lost the ability to speak, then move. His soldiers, hearing rumors of his death, demanded to see him. In one of history's most poignant scenes, the entire Macedonian army filed past their dying king. Alexander could only move his eyes and weakly raise his hand in acknowledgement of each man. For Alexander, as his fever rose and his strength faded, the reality must have been crushing. All his conquests, all his glory, and he would die at 32 without a clear heir or a stable succession plan. When asked to whom he left his empire, he allegedly whispered, "To the strongest," guaranteeing the civil wars that would tear his empire apart. On June 10th or 11th, 323 BC, Alexander the Great died. The cause remains a mystery. Poison, malaria, typhoid fever, or even West Nile virus have all been suggested. What is clear is that with his death, the age of the invincible Macedonian army ended. Without Alexander's charisma and genius, the army that had never lost a battle would tear itself apart in succession wars. As for the Macedonian army, it fragmented among Alexander's generals. These diadochi, successors, carved up the empire and spent the next 40 years fighting each other with the same tactics and veterans who had once conquered the world together. The invincible army became its own worst enemy. Within a generation, Macedon itself would become a Roman province. The kingdom that had conquered the world couldn't even maintain its own independence. Ultimately, though, the people who suffered most were the common soldiers and civilians caught in the endless succession wars. Families who had sent sons to follow Alexander to glory received back broken men fighting their former comrades for scraps of empire. What is clear is this story was an example of how personal charisma and military genius can create seemingly impossible victories. But without institutions and clear succession, even the greatest achievements crumble. Reports suggest that towards the end, Alexander had gone from a brilliant young king who fought beside his men to an isolated autocrat who executed longtime companions for questioning him. The very qualities that made him great, his ambition, his refusal to accept limits, his belief in his own divinity, also doomed him. What's really interesting, though, is how Alexander's legacy shaped the world. His conquests spread Greek culture across Asia, creating the Hellenistic Age. The cities he founded became centers of learning and trade for centuries. The fusion of Greek and Eastern cultures he forced would influence everything from Buddhist art to Islamic science. In many ways, Alexander succeeded in his goal of conquering the world, not through permanent political control, but through cultural transformation that lasted millennia. Modern military academies still study his tactics. The concept of combined arms, using different types of units in coordination, remains fundamental to warfare. His use of speed, surprise, and psychological warfare predated similar strategies by centuries. But perhaps the most important lesson from Alexander and his invincible army is about the nature of power itself. No military force, no matter how dominant, can outlast the system that created it. The Macedonian army was invincible, not because of superior weapons or numbers, but because of the unique combination of Philip's innovations, Alexander's genius, and the historical moment that allowed a small kingdom to exploit the weaknesses of a decaying empire. When any of these elements changed, The invincibility vanished like morning mist. Now, whilst the story of Alexander's invincible army is pretty incredible, I still wouldn't call him the most ruthless conqueror in history. For that, you're going to want to check out the absolutely insane story of Genghis Khan, a man who killed so many people that he actually cooled the planet's temperature. We're talking about someone who turned entire civilizations into skull pyramids and considered it a productive Tuesday. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.